This is a recording of Chapter 10, Part 2. We're going to start off with meat production. And meat production includes meat and animal products such as eggs and milk. Between 1961 and the year 2012, world meat production, including beef, pork, and poultry, increased more than fourfold. And the average amounts of meat that people were eating more than doubled in that time period. And global meat production is expected to continue to increase, and that is mainly because people who did not really eat meat before are now able to afford it. And that's going to be seen in rapidly developing countries such as China and India. And we saw part of that concept being discussed in the movie, The Journey to the Planet Earth, the state of the planet's wildlife. About 1/2 of the world's meat comes from livestock grazing on grass, and that is where you have rangelands and pastures. We discussed that in a previous lecture. The other half of the world's meat production is produced through an industrialized system, and that includes animals being raised in crowded feedlots and what we call concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. And in these operations, the animals are fed grain, fish meal, fish oil, growth hormones, and antibiotics. And the animals are bred to gain weight quickly. They're not fed what they normally would eat naturally. So for example, cows eat grass and clovers and things like that. They don't eat grain typically in nature. And they don't eat grain when they're living on a range or eating in a pasture. And then feedlots and CAFOs and the animal wastes and runoff associated with them actually have some serious environmental impacts on the air and water. Here are a couple of examples of feedlot and concentrated meat production facilities. So the top is concentration of chickens in an operation in Iowa. And on the bottom right is showing you a cattle feedlot. So there are some harmful consequences and there are some benefits to having industrialized meat production. A benefit would be that industrializing the production of meat allows for an increase in meat production, and it reduces the overgrazing of ranches and pastures. Also, it's definitely profitable. It has high profit yields. And it also makes meat more affordable, and then that allows for an increase in consumption of meat for people who may not have been able to afford it otherwise. But some harmful consequences are that industrialized meat production requires a lot of energy, and that comes in the form of fossil fuels. Also, it requires a great deal of water. And that's both in the process of raising the animals and in the slaughter process. There were also huge amounts of animal waste produced, and then that animal waste may pollute air and water, for example, when it runs off into local waterways, when there were floods or just a lot of rain, for example. And the greenhouse gas emissions, that would be mainly methane coming from the animals and from animal waste, as well as burning fossil fuels, which would give you the carbon dioxide as well as other greenhouse gases. And here is a waste lagoon. So a waste lagoon is like a pit associated with these feedlots, and that's where the animal waste goes. And then the decay of the animal waste creates methane, which is going to be released into the atmosphere. And methane is actually a very strong greenhouse gas. Another problem with waste lagoons is flooding. And this has happened in North Carolina, where you have a lot of hog farms, or hog feedlots rather. And for example, when you had Hurricane Florence hit North Carolina, you had these hog farms or hog feedlots, the waste lagoons got flooded actually. And then all that waste ends up in local waterways. And then going back to greenhouse gas emissions, the industrialization of meat production generates about 18% of the world's greenhouse gases. And part of that is that cattle and dairy cows release methane as flatulence. And then also the animal manure stored in the waste lagoons also generates methane in the decay process. Some other harmful consequences to industrialized meat production is that meat becomes artificially cheap, artificially inexpensive. And that's because the harmful environmental and health costs are not included in the prices of the meat. We talked about that earlier in the semester, that when we talked about it mainly with gasoline, for example, that if you take into the consideration the environmental problems related to gasoline and the health problems related to it, right? We talked about that. So in this case, the harmful environmental and health costs of the industrialized meat and industrialized agriculture is not included in the prices. So we consider that to be artificially cheap. Also, overgrazing by livestock has degraded grasslands and pastures. So that would actually be that would be a harmful environmental consequence of the meat production, but then it might be a little bit of a benefit, like a pro towards the feedlots, because then you're not having overgrazing. So the overgrazing comment somewhat goes into two different categories, a pro and a con. Also, the widespread use of antibiotics in industrialized livestock production has led to some consequences that are harmful. And actually, 70% of antibiotics that are used in the US are added to animal feed to prevent the spread of diseases when you have animals living so closely together in these feedlots. And the antibiotics also make the livestock animals grow faster. So this overuse of antibiotics is an important factor in the rise of bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics. And then that reduces the effectiveness of antibiotics, so that if a human gets sick from a bacterial infection, antibiotics may not work as well because of the resistance to antibiotics that happens when you overuse antibiotics. Also, another harmful environmental consequence is the disruption of nutrient cycling. So globally, only about half of all manure is returned to the land as fertilizer, and the fertilizer is the manure because there's nutrients in it. So when you don't allow the manure to go back into the ground, into the soil, you're disrupting the nutrient cycle and the chemical cycling, which is a key principle of sustainability. And you're disrupting the cycle by leaving the waste in these waste lagoons and not allowing the waste to go back into the soil. Now, the rest of that half, right, we said globally only about half the manure is returned to the land. So the rest of it ends up polluting aquatic systems and emitting greenhouse gases as it decays. It also produces a lot of foul odors, which is not going to be good for people who live near feedlots. And then you could read the advantages and disadvantages here for having animal feedlots or industrialized meat production. Then we have a case study. This case study is about how meat production in the Midwest of the United States led to ocean dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. So what started it was you had a lot of synthetic inorganic fertilizers that were used to produce corn for animal feed and to use as ethanol for cars. And actually, a lot of the corn grown in this country ends up being used for animal feed. So a lot of the fertilizer that was applied to the ground in the Midwest, in the cornfields, it runs off of the cropland and it ends up in the Mississippi River. And then you have fertilizer typically has nitrates and phosphate nutrients. So then what happens is you're actually fertilizing the water, and the Mississippi River ends in the Gulf of Mexico. So this whole process ends up fertilizing the coastal waters in the Gulf of Mexico. And then what happens is you have algae blooms. And you learned in the nutrient pollution lab that we did right before we went to online instruction, the computer nutrient lab, you learned that when you have an algae bloom, the algae dies eventually, and then it gets decomposed, and the decay process uses up a lot of oxygen. When the bacteria decompose the dead algae, it uses up oxygen. So you're fertilizing the water, you get a lot of algae growing, and then the algae dies eventually and decomposes, which results in a low oxygen levels in the water. And then that low oxygen, which is called hypoxia, can actually harm the aquatic life, and it leads to a decline in the seafood production of the Gulf of Mexico. So this would affect people who, let's say, live in New Orleans in Louisiana, where the seafood industry is a major industry that they have down there. This type of thing affects their livelihood because you're losing a lot of the aquatic life due to the lack of oxygen. And it's mainly because we're growing so much corn to use as animal feed to feed the livestock in the feedlots. So it's like a whole domino effect. And this shows you the drainage basin of the Mississippi River, so you get a better idea of the Midwest of the country and how all of the runoff from any farmland that's applying fertilizer, it generally all ends up in the Mississippi River, which ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. Then we have fish and shellfish production. We mentioned this in a previous chapter, so we're only going to go into a little bit of detail here. So just a reminder, a fishery is a concentration of a particular aquatic species that is suitable for commercial harvesting. And the fishery is going to be in an area of the ocean or an inland body of water. And industrial fishing fleets harvest most of the wild fish that are caught around the world. Then we have the word aquaculture. That is the practice of raising marine and freshwater fish in freshwater ponds and rice paddies, or in underwater cages in coastal waters or in deeper ocean waters. And this photo here is of a shrimp farm in Thailand. So aquaculture is a little bit more like agriculture, and fishery is more like you're going out into the ocean or into a body of water and catching a lot of the fish that naturally are living in that area. So overfishing, ocean pollution, and climate change may lead to a collapse of most of the world's major commercial ocean fisheries by the year 2050. And about 1/3 of wild fish caught from oceans is used to make fish meal and fish oil, which is then fed to farmed fish. And then that contributes to the depletion of many populations of wild fish, which are crucial to marine food webs. Another problem with aquaculture is that some of the fish meal and fish oil that is fed to the farm-raised fish is contaminated with toxins like PCBs and dioxin. So that means that the fish feed could have pesticides in it. And then the farm-raised fish are consuming pesticides. There is a debate, however, over if these toxins are present in high enough concentrations to be harmful or not. Fish farms also produce large amounts of wastes, including pesticides and antibiotics that are used on the fish farms. Fish on fish farms can also escape their pens, and then they could end up mixing with wild fish, and then that could possibly disrupt the gene pool of the wild fish populations. Major seed companies are pushing to use patented GMO soybeans as the primary feed for farm-raised fish and shellfish. But fish that are fed soy tend to create more waste, actually. So that would lead to more water pollution. And then you would have to grow more soybeans somewhere. So that could lead to more deforestation as you clear, let's say, a forest to grow more soybeans on clear farmland. So this chart just shows you advantages and disadvantages of aquaculture. So you could read through that. So then we have more pros and cons related to industrialized feed production. Industrialized food production requires huge inputs of energy. And basically it's been made possible because of the availability of energy like oil and natural gas. So the fossil fuels are needed to run the farm machinery, to irrigate crops and produce synthetic pesticides and synthetic inorganic fertilizers. So those chemicals are actually going to use, they're going to require energy in the factory to actually make those products. Also, you need energy to process food and transport it. Many times you're transporting food over long distances. So because of all of that energy that you need to put into the system, industrialized food is going to have a large net energy loss. Because when you eat meat, the amounts of energy you're gaining from, like, let's say one hamburger, the amount of energy that was used to produce that hamburger, including the food that was grown to feed the cow, and including the fuel of transporting it to the store, there was a large net loss. So a lot more energy went into making that hamburger than what you're getting from the calories that you're consuming. So industrialized food production has actually increased the world's production of meat since 1950, which is a good thing. It's helped feed the growing population of the world. However, it is not a very sustainable production method because of the harmful environmental effects, because of all the energy that goes into it, because you have that energy, the net energy loss. According to many analysts, agriculture has a greater total harmful environmental impact than any other human activity. And this is a chart from the book. It goes into harmful environmental effects of food production. So you could read through that. Then we have soil erosion. Topsoil erosion is a serious problem around the world. Soil erosion is the movement of soil components, especially nutrient-rich topsoil, from one place to another by the actions of wind and water. And topsoil is the fertile top layer of many soils. And flowing water from rainfall is the leading cause of topsoil erosion. And you could see this photo down here. There is a farm, and you could see soil erosion in this little area here. You have runoff with a lot of mud in it. That's sediment particles that came off of the farm in the rainwater. So you're losing soil in this runoff here. And there are harmful effects of topsoil erosion, mainly that you're losing fertility of the soil. You're losing plant nutrients. Also, you have water pollution. As you saw in the previous photo, there was a lot of mud and sediment in that water. So that's going to end up in a local waterway, like a river or a lake. And that's going to cause water pollution. Just the fact that it's sediment making a body of water more muddy, and that prevents sunlight from passing through the water, things like that. But also, if the soil comes from a farm, it most likely had pesticides attached to the soil particles. And then those pesticides can end up becoming biomagnified in the food web. And then also the nutrients from the eroded soil can end up fertilizing the waterways, let's say a local lake, and potentially lead to eutrophication, which we discussed in a previous lecture. So this map just shows you where topsoil erosion is a serious concern, where it is some concern, and where either there is no vegetation, so we don't have to worry about the soil erosion like in Antarctica, or where the soil is considered to be stable. Then we have desertification. Desertification is the expansion of deserts into what was formerly productive land. Desertification can occur in semi-arid regions that border existing deserts. So these are going to be areas at the margins of deserts, like the grasslands, savanna, steppes. Okay, these are areas that are sort of dry. They have a dry season, and they're vulnerable to desertification. And the causes of desertification include drought, overgrazing by herding animals that eat grass, deforestation, overuse of water supplies, and agriculture that has altered the natural vegetation patterns. All of these factors lead to the soil drying up, crumbling, and then being carried away by the wind and water. And that is all soil erosion. So south of the Sahara Desert is the Sahel, and it has been hit hard by desertification. Drought is common there, and the land can only support a limited number of people and livestock. So when you have overpopulation, it can lead to famine and then malnutrition and poverty. And Mongolia and other parts of China are experiencing the expansion of the Gobi Desert. Climate change is definitely enhancing desertification. And then this is a photo of part of West Africa, where you have an oasis with all these plants over here, and you have sand dunes right next to it. So this area is vulnerable to desertification, this area here. Then we have a couple of videos, and I'd like you to watch these on your own. This one's about 10 minutes. This one is just under 1 minute. And this one, I really like this video. It talks about how people in the Sahel in Africa are fighting back against desertification. And what they're doing is they're planting acacia gum trees. And the acacia gum trees are resistant to drought. So when you plant these trees, even in a drought, the trees are going to be there, and they hold the soil in place. The roots of the trees hold the soil in place, and it creates shade to cool down the land right underneath the trees. So this project that they started really worked out pretty well in helping to fight against the desertification. So that's pretty much the summary, but it is a really good little clip, and it's just under 8 minutes. So you can watch that on your own as well. So then we have the Dust Bowl. And the Great Plains Prairies region in the United States is usually semi-arid grassland. And naturally, or the native grasses in the Great Plains are drought-resistant grasses. However, a brief wet period led to people thinking that this was a great, lush, wet area where you could do a lot of farming. So this brief wet period led to over farming, and people removed the native grasses and they grew crops. But generally it's a semi-arid grassland. It's not wet, or not wet all the time. So after this unusually wet period ended, drought set back in, and the crops failed, and the soil dried up and was eroded away by wind. And you have strong prevailing westerly winds westerly, again, it means it's coming from the west going eastward. So these strong winds blow over much of the Great Plains. And when wind blows over flat land, it's not slowed down or stopped by friction. So all of these factors together increased the soil erosion. And also when they removed the native grasses, the roots held the soil in place. So when you remove the grasses to grow crops and then the crops died, you're disrupting that natural soil protection from the native grasses. So we ended up with this dust bowl of the 1930s, where we had large dust storms that went across the Great Plains. And the Dust Bowl affected about 100 million acres of land in Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, and Kansas. And the photo here shows you a Colorado dust storm. And there were times where the dust storms were so severe that you couldn't even see in front of you. So some other problems with soil other than desertification. We have soil pollution. Now you can actually have atmospheric deposition of pollution onto the soil. And that's from chemicals that are in the air. And they get in the air from either industrial plants, power plants, and motor vehicles. So you have the release of chemicals into the atmosphere, and then those chemicals fall down to the ground and pollute the soil. That's actually one of the ways that we get mercury. Actually, there's some areas where you get mercury in the soil that way. It's not a lot of mercury, but it is a little bit. For example, another example was before gasoline in this country became unleaded, we had lead in the gasoline, and lead would get deposited in the soil due to atmospheric deposition. So, you go in a car, the gas would burn, the exhaust would come out of the vehicle. Some of that exhaust had lead particles, and then that would get deposited into soil. And we have seen a decrease in the amount of lead in soil since we have unleaded gas now. Since they took the lead out of gas, we've seen a decrease of lead in soil. Also, you have the direct application of pollution, for example, putting pesticides on the ground, or from using irrigation water that has been contaminated. So that brings us to irrigation. Irrigation allows farms to be more productive. Irrigation water is usually a dilute solution of various salts, actually. And the salts are picked up as the water flows over or through soil and rocks. And then the salts get concentrated when the water evaporates. And then that leaves the topsoil with a thin layer of salt on it. And when you constantly repeat applications of irrigation water in dry climates, it leads to soil degradation with the salt layers, and this is called salinization. And that harms crops. It lowers the crop yields, and it could kill plants and ruin the land. So you see in this photo here, this is heavily irrigated land in Colorado. So over time, when you're constantly putting irrigation water on this land, it has salts in it, And then when the water evaporates off of this land, off the farmland, it leaves the salt behind. So eventually you can't use this land for growing crops because most plants, most crops can't grow in salt rich soil. Now, there's another problem with over or excessive irrigation, and that's called waterlogging. And you see in this photo, when you dig a hole in the ground, the water table is pretty high. It's all soggy. There's a lot of water down there in the hole. That's waterlogged. So water accumulates underground and raises the water table. So about 1/10 of the world's irrigated land actually suffers from waterlogging. Another problem with irrigation water that could be contaminated is when you have E. coli related to using sewage contaminated irrigation water. And in 2006, a CDC investigation linked a multi-state outbreak of E. coli to fresh bagged spinach from California. And the E. coli from the spinach farm was most likely from cattle and pig feces that ended up in the nearby waterways where the irrigation water was retrieved from. So that's an example of contaminated irrigation water. Also, if excessive irrigation can also contribute to depletion of groundwater and surface water supplies. And we're going to talk about that more in chapter 11. So how do we reduce soil erosion? We can use soil conservation methods or topsoil conservation. And that involves reducing soil erosion and restoring the soil fertility. And mostly we could do that by keeping the soil covered with vegetation. Now, one of the ways of keeping soil covered with vegetation is to use polyculture. And we talked about that in the previous lecture on part 1 of chapter 10, where you have different types of crops grown on the same land. So then you are lessening the amount of time that the farm is completely void of plants when it is just bare soil. So there were some methods that farmers can use to reduce soil erosion. And that includes terracing and contour planting. And that's when you grow food on steep slopes. So that keeps you from having topsoil eroding away. Also, there's something called strip cropping. That involves planting alternating strips of a row crop and another crop that completely covers the soil. That would be called a cover crop. Alley cropping involves one or more crops planted together in strips or alleys between trees and shrubs that provide shade. Farmers can establish windbreaks or shelter belts, and that's trees that you plant around crop fields, and that reduces wind erosion. Conservation tillage farming is when you use special tillers and planting machines that drill seeds directly through crop residues into undisturbed soil. A crop residue would be without clearing the land of the previous crops that you harvested from, you leave the plant material there. So you're leaving the soil covered, and then you drill down into those crop residues. Also, farmers can stop farming on marginal cropland. Marginal cropland is going to be an area where climate leaves soil vulnerable to topsoil erosion and desertification. So in this photo, we have terracing. In this photo, we have contour planting and strip cropping. This photo, we have alley cropping. See, it's trees in a row and then crops in a row. And down here, you see, it looks like corn. So it's a corn row and then rows of trees. And then next to that would be another row of corn. And so on and so on. Rows of corn and then trees in between. These are windbreaks. Now, if topsoil conservation is not possible, then restoring lost plant nutrients is the next best option. And this is achieved by using fertilizers. Now, you could use organic fertilizer, and that comes from plant and animal materials like animal manure. And that adds organic nitrogen back into the soil. And that stimulates the growth of soil bacteria and different fungi. Also, compost. Compost is produced when microorganisms in soil break down organic matter, and the organic matter can come from animal or plant materials. We discussed compost and composting in a previous lecture. Now, keep in mind, organic agriculture uses only organic fertilizers and crop rotation to replenish nutrients. Crop rotation is when you rotate which crops you grow on different parts of land so that certain plants are taking up certain nutrients. And then after a while, those plants won't do well on that land because they took up all the nutrients. But if you rotate your crops, then you put a different plant that might like more of a different nutrient. So it gives the soil time to regenerate and have the nutrients get replenished. This is a photo of chickens that are free range, and their manure is adding fertilizer to the soil. And they actually have mobile chicken coops that they move around, and that distributes the manure more evenly around the farm, and then that reduces the runoff of fertilizer. And it's all organic fertilizer from the chicken coop. Now, you could also restore soil fertility by using synthetic inorganic fertilizers. And that's through inorganic compounds that contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the three main nutrients that you want in fertilizer: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. So inorganic fertilizer use has grown more than 900% since 1950. And fertilizer runoff can end up polluting waterways, either nearby waterways or by flowing downstream and then ending up in coastal waters. Now, synthetic inorganic fertilizers do not replace organic matter. So to completely restore nutrients to topsoil, both inorganic and organic fertilizers should be used. And then how do we reduce soil salinization? One way to prevent and deal with soil salinization is to reduce the amount of water that is put onto farmland by using more efficient irrigation methods. So you have this method called drip or trickle irrigation. It's also called micro irrigation. That is the most efficient way to deliver small amounts of fresh water to crops. And you are delivering the water precisely. So little bits of water are delivered precisely where they need to be delivered. So this drastically reduces freshwater waste because 90 to 95% of the water input reaches the crops. So you're not just pouring water all over a farm, you're allowing water to trickle right where it needs to go, just around each crop plant. Also, then you're using less fresh water, you're reducing the amount of the salinization from irrigation water. We call it fresh water, but it really is still that irrigation water that has salts in it from running through rocks and soil. So these are 3 types of systems commonly used to irrigate crops. So you have gravity flow. That's when water usually comes from an aqueduct system or a nearby river. And this is 60 to 80% efficient. Then you have a center pivot, which is about 80% efficient. And then the drip irrigation is what I was just saying is the most efficient, 90 to 95% efficient. So you have these tubes that deliver water directly to the plant roots, and it only goes around each individual plant. It's not just like spraying water over the whole land, because like right here in the middle of these trees, you don't need any water to be applied there. You only need it to be around where it would go right into the roots. So then you could read through this. These are just ways to prevent soil salinization and ways of cleaning it up. And then how to reduce desertification. It's pretty difficult because we can't control prolonged droughts. But we can reduce methods that leave land vulnerable to soil erosion and then desertification. So we can reduce overgrazing, we can reduce deforestation, and we could reduce or stop destructive forms of planting, irrigation, and mining. We could also work towards slowing projected climate change, because the climate change that we're expecting to have happen will most likely lead to severe and prolonged droughts. Also, we can restore vegetation by planting native trees and grasses. And you saw that in the movie Journey to the Planet Earth, the state of the planet's wildlife, by Lake Baringo, where they were planting native grasses. You saw them do that in that video.